It is said that the Reformation was a theological awakening, a protest against corruption, a rediscovery of Scripture, and a redefinition of faith. But what if the truth is far more material? What if the Reformation was less about theology and more about looting, power, and the calculated dismantling of Catholicism? This video I made argues that the Reformation, though sparked by genuine concerns in theological language, was at its core a financial and political revolution, one that eroded the Church's strength by attacking its wealth, its institutions, and ultimately its ability to unify Europe under its sacred order. Martin Luther may have sincerely objected to abuse in the Church, but his rebellion quickly became a platform for ego. Instead of submitting his concerns to Rome, he set himself up as a rival authority. He used the language of theology, but behind his protests against decadence lay a deeply self-indulgent spirit. He rejected centuries of church tradition, dismantled the sacramental order, and opened the door to fragmentation and confusion. The most powerful actors in the Reformation were not theologians but princes. In regions like Saxony and Hesse in Germany, in England under Henry VIII, starting in 1534 with the Act of Supremacy, and in Denmark/Norway under King Christian III in the 1530s. Rulers used the Reformation to confiscate church lands, seize monasteries, and free themselves from papal taxation. They presented their actions as pious reform, but the material gain was undeniable. A massive transfer of wealth from the church to secular authorities. It was a religious justification for what amounted to state-sponsored looting. And under John Calvin, the Reformation took on an even more structured justification for economic control. Calvin's Geneva in the 1540s exemplified this. City councils, inspired by Calvinist ideas, dismantled Catholic institutions, absorbed their resources, and redirected them into civic governance. Calvinism encouraged not only frugality and discipline, but also sanctified wealth accumulation. While it appeared to promote the common good through simplicity and reinvestment, it also created theological space for usury and predatory capital. This marked a dangerous break from Catholic social teaching, which strictly condemned exploitative finance. Catholicism, by contrast, explicitly advocates for the common and communal good. The church's wealth expressed in art, architecture, and education was not hoarded but redistributed in service to the faithful, especially the poor. Protestantism and Calvinism in particular stripped this vision in favor of economic models that often ended up benefiting the elites at the expense of the many. It's a common thing we see today. What followed was chaos. The unity of Christendom shattered. Dozens of sects appeared, each claiming authority. The authority of Rome, which once unified Europe in a spiritual and moral order, was cast aside. In place of a unified church stood national churches, state-controlled religion, and an increasing submission to temporal power over spiritual truth. The Reformation didn't purify the church, it stripped it bare. Sacred art, music, liturgy, and mystery were cast off as idolatry, but this wasn't humility. It was a form of spiritual iconoclasm. What Luther condemned as decadence was often the visible glory of God. The church used her resources to elevate the masses, catechize the illiterate, and beautify the worship of the divine. The Reformation flattened all this. The foundational sin of the Reformation was not greed alone, it was ego. And this is my thesis on this. Partially I believe it was looting. So the oligarchy, or the aristocracy, you could say, in the modern day is the capital class. They use the Reformation as an excuse to loot and seize these properties of the church, which once you confiscate, it erodes the influence and strength of the church. And when you speak on the theologians or the Reformation figureheads, i.e. Calvin, Luther, Zwingli, and the rest of them, it's ego. It's saying I can interpret the word, the book, the scripture different than what the papal interpretation is. So it's fundamentally ego. So that's why which is obviously, a grave sin, I believe. I don't know too much the difference between grave or not, but it's definitely a sin. It's not conforming to what was ordained by God, which is to follow the one true church. So, back to it. Man believed he could stand in judgment over the bride of Christ rather than reform within. Luther and others chose defiance that exalted the individual conscience over the church's authority. The result was not liberation, but endless division. Which is a good point because Protestantism just every day there's a new sect, apparently. The Reformation was not just a religious rupture, it was a proto Enlightenment event. So, this is another point I put in this script, and it was just like the Enlightenment, just further eroding the church and the soul of Europe, which I don't know that I coined this word, but it's chronoprophetic in the sense that it reveals through looking at chronology and history. It's a prophecy that unravels and reveals with further examination. So it laid the intellectual and cultural groundwork for the secular age by weakening Rome's authority and elevating private interpretation over divine hierarchy. It invited the rise of rationalism, skepticism, and ultimately a desacralized Europe. Chronoprophetically, the Reformation signaled the beginning of Europe's spiritual exile. Like ancient Israel, it has received the truth and then rebelled against it. What followed was not light, but disintegration. Ironically, in tearing down the church for its supposed greed, the Reformation set the stage for true systematic greed, capitalism. The looting of monastic lands, such as during the English dissolution of the monasteries from 1536 to 1541, the elevation of private property over communal stability, and the moral justification of profit. Now it's important to clarify, capitalism has pre-Reformation roots, particularly in Catholic mercantile cities like Venice and Florence, but what the Reformation did was accelerate and theologically legitimize this new economic ethos by rejecting the church's constraints of usury and economic excess. Protestant regions gave rise to a system where market logic replaced moral order. This order would go on to consolidate wealth into the hands of the few, stripping the laboring classes of its dignity and spiritual anchoring. The church's critique of usury, its defense of the poor, and its holistic vision of society would discard it in favor of mechanized production and unchecked accumulation. If we look at history not just politically but chronoprophetically, we see that the Reformation marks a key moment in the rebellion of the world against Christendom. It cloaked material ambition in the language of faith, and in doing so it weakened the one institution that could resist the growing power of the state, the merchant, and the ego. The lesson is clear. True reform begins with humility, not pride, and true beauty is not a vice to be stripped away, but a sign of God's glory on earth. So that's my thesis on the basis of the Reformation and what it truly meant. Looking back on how it's influenced Europe and liberal societies, and I tie it to the Enlightenment and when it a few segments or a segment ago, it said, speaking on Venice and Florence, I'm learning a little bit about these, proto-capitalist city-states that were in Italy. The not just the Fuggers, but the Medicis, and how they were wealthy from fabrics and then got into banking, and it sucked the resources of the Florent I believe of the Venetians, but also from the Florentines, I believe is how you say it. And how Michael Jones puts it is that it took the family wage and commodified wages even back then This wasn't even the 70s yet, or after the 50s in the US, but even back then they were trying to commodify wages and cheapen the labor. And I'll definitely make a video on that because that's extremely fascinating. You know, 16th century history, I believe. No, wait, this was like 1400. So, 15th century, something like this. But the point being is that even back then, we could see that the capital class, the elites, these groups, they consolidate wealth and strip the actual true wealth, going against Adam Smith's principles that the true wealth of a nation lies in its labor, its capacity to industrial, or its base that actually does the industrialization, its base that actually solves the problems and builds these things, the infrastructure. So yeah, I definitely gotta make a video on that. But I got a lot of this rhetoric from E. Michael Jones, so I definitely gotta give credit where credit's due. He's very wise. He's very enlightened, no pun intended, to the history of Europe, and it's very interesting. When I learned a little bit about these things in school, I remember being so bored, but they really don't paint it in this way. They say, "Oh, these were just events. They didn't signify anything," but they did. And we can see that we can infer all what I said. I mean, it's looting, eroding the church by looting and using and believing your ego. But this is part one, what the Reformation was truly about. I hope you enjoyed it. And subscribe for part two, who taught the world how to work.